The beauty of a really good parable, as in the case of today's, is that it's timeless and it has multiple ways of interpreting it. On the flip side, the problem with a parable as good as this one is that it's been told and dissected over the millenniums. So much so that our reaction is to say, here we go again, and perhaps even stop listening altogether. The gospel we read for today is actually the culmination of 3 parables in Luke chapter 15 that celebrate the joy of finding what was lost. It started with the parable of the lost sheep, followed by the parable of the lost coin, and finally, today's parable of the lost son. Jesus told these parables of grace in response to the complaints of the Pharisees and the scribes who criticized Jesus for eating with known sinners. The parable in today's passage is unique to Luke's gospel and has several layers of meaning that provide a deep richness of interpretation and insight. I won't retell the entire story because, well, we just heard it, and we know the story well. However, I think we often forget how crucial the message we hear today would have been to those of Jesus' time. We've heard the story so many times, we perhaps have become numb to how earth-shattering his words really are. In Jesus' time, the shame-honor culture, to ask a living parent for an early inheritance was beyond rude. N.T. Wright explains that by asking for his share before his father's death, it was equivalent of saying, "I wish you were dead." And children who made such a request lost the respect and honor of not only their family, but also their community, who most likely would have ostracized them. This is the first earth-shattering piece of this story, and would have caught the attention of those hearing it for the very first time. And then, to go even further, contrary to all expectations, the loving father agrees to divide the property between his sons. Doesn't ask, just does it. When the son returns, having wasted all his inheritance, the loving father is thrilled to see his son. He ignores all the cultural norms of his time and runs to welcome, embrace, and kiss his son before the son can even approach him to apologize. The father's response to the reckless spending and wasting of the son's inheritance is to do almost the same thing, to be extravagantly reckless with his forgiveness and his grace. In Archbishop Desmond Tutu's book titled "God Has a Dream," he writes, "I have a dream," God says. "Please help me to realize it. It is a dream of a world whose ugliness and squalor and poverty, its war and hostility, its greed and harsh competitiveness, its alienation and disharmony are changed into their glorious counterparts, when there will be more laughter, joy, and peace, where there will be justice and goodness and compassion and love and caring and sharing. I have a dream," he says, "that swords will be beaten into plowshares and spears into running hooks, that my children will know that they are members of one family, the human family, God's family, my family." How exciting was it that today, this family of St. David's gathered between services to dream exactly that, to dream what it means to be God's family, especially today. The last several years have been really hard on many of us. There's so much misery and hardship in this world, so much living in both physical and spiritual hunger, and in decline of all that what we see as holy. There is a lot of loneliness, disconnection, and isolation. The pandemic has exacerbated much of that and has changed the landscape of our lives and of churches everywhere, including here at St. David's. It's taught us a lot. There is still much to be learned and actually unlearned as a result. And so we invited this place, this church, this community to enter into conversation earlier today, to be part of that dream that Desmond Tutu speaks about, so that we can be the loving arms, the loving, embracing arms that we and all this beautiful city of Austin needs. The world desperately needs us to show it what it means to love like the Father loves in this parable. The world desperately needs this reconciling, redemptive, life-giving, life-transforming, recreating, resurrecting kind of love. The kind that doesn't shame and blame, but rather embraces with the love of our Creator. This is what the prodigal son is all about. It's not really about the son at all, but rather this unbridled, abundant, and reconciling love of the Father. You see, it's God's nature to forgive. That, my friends, is the heart of the story. The story about a father whose love is strong enough to allow the past to stay in the past, and a story that tells us that no matter what we do, our Father, our God, is willing to forgive us. The Father's response to the reckless spending and wasting of the son's inheritance is to do much the same, to be extravagantly reckless with his forgiveness and grace. It's the Father, however, who is truly the prodigal in the gospel, the one who loves extravagantly and does not withdraw that love in the face of the disrespect, greed, resentment, and surliness shown by his sons, both sons. The God we see mirrored in the welcome of the Father is in fact the same God we saw reflected in the extra care offered to the barren fig tree by the gardener that we heard in last week's gospel. One of my favorite images from today's parable is the seemingly very small detail when the father sees his long-gone son approaching from afar, and he picks up his robes and starts running towards him. You see, respectable men in those days wouldn't have been seen running, probably would have disdained running at all. Sorry, you runners that are out there. And yet his father tears down the road, robes flying, to meet his child with open arms, and completes it with a loving embrace and a kiss. Let that image sit with you for a moment. That's a pretty awesome image. In the end, this brilliant parable points to the great embrace and deep, expansive love, compassion, and justice of our God. That's deeper and wider and higher than anything we could ever imagine. That is the love God has for each and every one of us. That reckless, unbridled, boundless, reconciling, restoring kind of love that waits for us with open arms and to greet us with that loving embrace. And that, my friends, is definitely cause for celebration. Amen.